I don't see how any comparison can be drawn because yes, they had a higher per capita GDP, they had a better living standard and everything at some point in time. But so did Pakistan for the first 40 years of independence.
Hello and welcome to Questioning Mind. I'm your host Sagarika, and today it is my absolute pleasure to welcome back to the channel Karan Bhasin, who's been here before. He is an economist working out of New York and has great insight into today's discussion, which is going to tell us the status of India in the current geopolitical economic scenario. So Karan, very welcome, and thanks so much for making the time on a Sunday to be here. Namaste.
The pleasure is entirely mine. Thank you for having me.
All right, so Karan, let's just dive into it. So with the recent situation in the neighborhood, we've had a lot of economists, a lot of politicians compare the condition of Sri Lanka's economy with India's. So
Right.
do you think it's a fair comparison? And what are the low points that India must consider,
Right. So I necessarily don't think that it's a fair comparison when you compare the situation in Sri Lanka with the kind of aggregate Indian economy. Largely because Indian economy is likely to be the fastest growing economy this year, probably even the next year, and it has a healthy reserves. Its currency is strengthening, even though people look at the dollar, but it's actually strengthening against yen, pound, euro, and so on and so forth. So we have favorable demographics. I think the situation, as in Sri Lanka, is less likely to occur in India. However, the bone of contention for me, and this is something that I've been even talking about for quite some time, is that the real kind of similar circumstance will be faced in a certain states of India, where they kind of do not respect any kind of fiscal discipline. Now, because of that fiscal discipline not being there, they spend on any kind of programs without realizing what is the bang for the buck they get. And the biggest problem in these states is that they don't view this money as taxpayers' money. They view it as a government money, and then they just want to use it to uh, announce programs, which probably gives them some political capital. But this political capital comes at the expense of human and physical capital, which could have been put in place in the state. And as an outcome of these policies over the years, their fiscal situation is quite bad, and it's in a alarming state, which is something that even the RBI mentioned very recently. Now, whether it will go in an extreme Sri Lankan case, I don't think that even for these states it is going to head down that path, because there are a lot of benefits from being a part of a fiscal and monetary union, so to say. So even if certain states kind of mess up in the process, right, they are kind of rest assured that the surplus that other states generate, the states that are performing well, would be used to kind of rescue them. And I think it is that understanding which is leading to this problem of moral hazard, so to say. You will be bailed out, so why wouldn't you want to
right,
gamble?
right, right. It's very interesting that you put it this way, because one of my follow-up questions was going to be, some of the states have been flagged by bureaucrats as well. Punjab, Telangana, Delhi, Andhra Pradesh, West Bengal, they're on the list of extreme welfareism states, offering extreme welfareism at the cost of fiscal benefit. It's very interesting that you discuss the Union of India, and, as a complete unit, we tend to perform better than individual states, because the call for a separate state is from a newly elected member of parliament from Punjab, so which is doing pretty badly. So it's interesting that buffer states like this we could very well face the same situation as Sri Lanka, and then there's no telling what
Right.
can happen. So it's not something that is merely or should merely be used for political gimmicking. I think it's a dangerous concept to have these ideas. Sri Lanka is not a great parallel to India, is something that you think in terms of economics. So what are the differences? What are the major differences, do you think? Because sure, we have reserves, but, just as a counter argument, people point out the rupee doing badly, and we have news media from every, across the spectrum pointing this out. And I understand that a lot of media we consume is without context. So if you could add the context to these things.
I don't think that the rupee is weakening at all. And I mean, this is something that somehow we have conditioned our minds to view the rupee, as a barometer of the health of the economy, which it necessarily isn't. But I'm not going to go into that argument because, people might kind of think that uh, it's too technical and it's too nuanced, so people might
And
not appreciate it.
sorry, I just want to point out, even a simple analogy-wise, we could say that China has artificially deflated, kept its own currency deflated over the years, right? That is
That is true. That is true. That yeah, that
so
is true. I mean, they want a
we
weaker
don't
currency,
use the same arguments for China. Then why do we do
right?
something?
Yeah, I mean that's a very simple way to put it, and that's precisely the point that I was kind of alluding to. That there are certain economies that want to keep their currency cheaper to benefit their industry. So, I mean, Japan has been doing it for the longest time.
Right,
So,
absolutely.
so
Although it's
uh,
not the best comparison at this time, right? Like it's doing pretty badly.
right. But I mean, it's kind of like interesting that for our somehow we have conditioned our mind into believing that. But all said and done, even if we view the health of rupee as a barometer of the health of the economy, right? My immediate question is then why do we only look at the dollar? I
Mm,
mean,
mm,
exchange rate movements depend on a variety of factors, right? Whether the rupee is gaining or weakening would depend on how it performs against a wide variety of currencies and not just the dollar alone. And the reason is that dollar is exceptional in terms of its appeal as a safe haven.
mm.
Everyone rushes to dollar assets when interest rates rise. All kinds of capital movements happen when interest rates are increased or decreased. Uh, this time around, what we are seeing is that even though the dollar is strengthening, rupee is strengthening as well. And the easiest way to see it is to look at some of the best performing currencies vis-a-vis the dollar. And India happens to be one of them. India has actually appreciated against the euro, against the yen, and against the British pound.
Yeah.
And I think that appreciation is a bigger concern for me because
Mm,
what it means is that for our exporters that are invoicing in those currencies, they are getting less and less and less rupees for the service that they're providing, which means they're being less competitive than their counterparts, say in China, Vietnam, etc. So, in an ideal scenario, we should be worried more about the rupee appreciation than looking at dollar rupee and then commenting that it's reached a new low and so on and so forth. I mean, of course, it's going to reach and I mean, it's going to reach to 82, 83, and then it's going to come back and find its natural value. And eventually, at some point, it will start strengthening once our economy is of that scale. Uh, but it's a process, right? I mean, you have to kind of
right.
appreciate the economic process as it is.
Right. No, it's very difficult, I think, when people take these data points out of context and use it for headlines, because I've seen this misinformation being very rapidly spread. And most people have very little idea about their own finances, so forget about the global economies. So
Right.
it's a little difficult to counter this sort of negative sentiment that is ongoing at this time. And the one thing that Indians do feel badly about at this time is very often the economy. Like at least the more media friendly, media consuming audiences are often fed this sort of information, and they do tend to view this economic impact negatively. So how
Might
much?
I might I might I add just one quick point since you
Yeah.
mentioned that people consume information. What a lot of people are doing is that they're comparing this with the taper tantrum episode of 2030 when the rupee started sliding and
Remember that?
there's a fundamental difference. At that time, rupee was weakening against a broad basket of currencies. That's not happening right now. So somehow, because of that experience, because of that kind of recent memory,
Mm-hmm.
we are confusing two very different events, two very different economies. It's the same economy, but the fundamentals are drastically different,
Right.
and the circumstances are also different, which adds another context to it. Right, 2013 is the post global financial crisis economy.
Mm-hmm.
22, this is pretty much the post pandemic economy, which is a much larger shock, and yet you see the rupee appreciate
Right.
and not depreciate. So that nuance somehow many in the media tend to uh, probably ignore, or maybe it's because it's too much of a collection of generalists there. Maybe I don't know. But having said that, I do think that a lot of people that you're mentioning who are more literate, more well-read,
Mm.
etc., they are a bit not they're a bit too pessimistic rather than optimistic. And the reason is that they'll read what's going on in Europe, they read what's going on in US, and based on that, they form their expectations about what's happening in India,
Mm. Mm. Mm.
which again, to some extent, might be true, but is not necessarily true.
Right. Right. So another thing, apart from the rupee appreciating and apparently depreciating, according to some
Right.
people, depreciating against the dollar, appreciating against other currencies. So apart from that, about inflation, inflation is supposed to be a good measure of the health of the economy, and it's very high right now. But it's higher in other nations, which is again another data
Right.
point. But in this geopolitical scenario, which it's pretty volatile at this time, what do you think about the inflation? How ideally, what should it be, and are we looking to get there anytime soon?
Right. So Indian inflation is at 7%. It hasn't crossed 7.5% at all as far as the data that I've looked at. And I'm talking about CPI because WPI, of course, we don't. I mean, WPI has no meaning for consumers. It is an important indicator for us, but for the average consumer, they care about CPI when they go into the market buy stuff. This is what inflation
Yeah.
is for them. And the target for the Reserve Bank of India is between 2 to 6. 4 plus minus 2. So it's outside the comfort zone, but it's not way too off. That's what I would say, and that's reassuring. And I think a lot of it is a lot of the present inflation is driven by fuel and food, factors that are beyond the control of the RBI. Inflation, as we all know, is now pretty much the responsibility of the Monetary Policy Committee. They're the ones with the mandate of keeping it in check at the Reserve Bank of India, and they've done a pretty good job during the pandemic, much better than what many other central bankers have in emerging markets. And of course, I disagree with the rate hikes that are happening in India because I think that the pace of it is probably too front loaded. It shouldn't have been that front loaded. But in retrospect, I think what the RBI is trying to do is correct. They're trying to bring down inflation so as to ensure that the value of the purchasing power for consumers is not eroded as fast because the economy is doing well. So that's one aspect of it. Now that 7% food fuel issues are largely being addressed even as we speak. International crude oil prices are coming down. There's an agreement to trade in rupees for oil. New measures taken by the Reserve Bank of India. So basically, there is a lot of uh, attempt and movement happening on the policy front to ensure that we get affordable petrol, affordable crude oil, energy supply, with the energy security in mind, and B, to kind of de-risk strengthening dollar and its impact on domestic fuel prices by going and purchasing in rupees. So those steps will definitely help uh, to a large extent. On food, a lot of the food shocks are global in nature, specifically around oils. Luckily for India, uh, we don't have a supply problem, which means that proactive management can address some of the
Sorry, could you
shortages.
repeat that? I didn't actually understand that. We don't have a.
R- We don't have a supply problem.
Oh, okay.
We
Sorry, I just
so
misheard.
so we don't have a supply problem, so we are relatively comfortable there as well. I mean, it's manageable.
Right.
But on inflation, what we have been saying, and somehow it's not sunk into people yet, is that for every 10% increase in the minimum support prices, headline inflation increases by 1.8%.
Wow.
So because food is a big point of
Right.
consumer basket. So when you see a lot of people talk about increasing MSPs and so on and so forth, they ignore this channel of inflation.
Well, it's the government that wanted to anyway. It's not even just the political.
Everyone wanted. I would say that everyone wanted the Swaminathan committee report to be accepted.
Yes.
There is a particular segment that till date thinks that it hasn't been implemented because they use the a different concept of cost plus 50%. They want even self-imputed rent, if I'm not mistaken, to be included in the cost, which would have increased MSPs much much beyond. So I think that the reason why MSP hikes are kind of over the last couple of quarters, we see that the growth rate has been less is precisely because of this fact. In 2018, there was a one-time jump when you
Hmm.
implemented the kind of committee's recommendation, and now gradually you're kind of finding your own, so to say. So on that front, I think next year and next to next year, India will see uh, four, maybe 4 to 5. Next year, at least 4 to 5, could be even lower. After that, we'll be back to 3.5% of inflation, which was the norm pre-pandemic.
Hmm.
And mind you, 3.5% inflation is not that high, and I think too low for an emerging market. I think it
Right.
should still be
Absolutely.
4.5. What happened in the pandemic was that suddenly certain prices went up, and when certain prices went up, so if you have an index which is measured and certain prices go up and you measure it on a year-on-year basis, there's a jump. And
Hmm.
now when you take the year-on-year for the next 1 year, because there was a one-time jump, your headline inflations would be higher,
Right.
which is
Absolutely.
why which is why it's also important to look at seasonally adjusted month-on-month figures to see the movement,
Mm,
which is what central banks in the West, primarily in the US, also kind of do very regularly. Inflation outside of India is a different ballgame altogether because that is primarily driven, I
mm,
would say, by fiscal excesses. Some say monetary excesses, but I would say by fiscal excesses, which were aided by monetary policy.
mm,
So you have a situation where certain countries have their inflation at 9%, which is much higher than
mm,
that in India. And on an average, if you remove the pandemic period, their average inflation used to be like 2%,
mm.
less than 2% actually. So it's more than 4.5 times. Uh, so I think that that fiscal excess that happened in certain Western countries is playing out now. It is leading to inflation becoming a more global problem for certain commodities, so to say, at least for this financial year. But as interest rates are hiking and as economies are slowing, because mind you, global economies are synchronizingly
Mm.
slowing, momentum is kind of dissipating over a period of time. Inflationary impulses would again be back to the normal. So I wouldn't be that worried about inflation per se, at least in India or at least even in many of the world, global economies.
So even in the US, you think it will be back to normal rates soon?
It will be back to normal. Now it depends on how do we define pretty soon. If we define pretty soon as 3 years, it will be normal. It will be
Mm,
back to that level. The question is that what is the price that we will pay to bring it back in terms of higher unemployment, lower growth, etc. And that's called the sacrifice ratio in monetary policy jargon. And I think the sacrifice ratio in a lot of these economies is high. I think Larry Summers and Olivier Blanchard just came out with a paper recently, policy paper at Peterson Institute. Their estimates suggest that they need to keep unemployment levels in US at 5%. Uh,
yes, yes. I remember the paper and the headlines following it. Why unemployment isn't so bad, or why inflation isn't so bad. Of course, followed
right,
by why we need to.
right.
Well,
So
yeah, I think from a scholarly perspective and from the economist circle understanding, it's a necessary policy. However, to feed it to an audience like that is currently suffering is pretty not something that can be popularized. Uh,
yeah, I mean, any increase in unemployment adds to poverty, adds to
of course,
impoverishment, and yeah. So, but the what is the counterfactual, right? If you let inflation run amok, then more people will lose.
right?
So, so it's like a deliberate and may seem as insensitive, but it is a kind of redistribution where you prevent a large amount of people from losing out by creating a system where some people lose out, but that some people who lose out, uh, by and large, are randomly selected. They might belong to certain kinds of professions. So you may see that they are like less educated, low income earners, but not every less educated, low income worker would be unemployed. So
Right.
there's a natural selection going on there.
So far, you've said that inflation isn't bad. You've said that unemployment isn't necessarily bad. You've, yeah, you're going
Okay,
to be
we need
quite
to
controversial. Now I
yeah,
know
but
you've placed
we
it in
need
the
to
right context.
yeah, we need to put it in the right. I mean, 4 to 5% inflation isn't bad. If it runs amok, it's bad for an emerging market. For advanced economies, 2 to 4 is manageable. And unemployment, if increased as an outcome of bringing down inflation, it's a necessary evil. It's a bitter pill that you have to swallow.
Right.
Because if we don't give this caveat, I'm
I
sure there will be a
expect
lot.
big headlines out of this.
Yeah, I don't want to read comments on the video criticizing left, right, center. So,
Right.
because
All right.
economists are hated everywhere. So,
I know, but you're one of those making relatively radical statements at this time because I've heard well-known economists go out there and say that India needs to, create more demand. We need to be more of a demand-driven economy. We need to print more money, loosen the purse strings, etc. Especially considering the reserves are high. So we'll come to that. One thing that I want to touch upon, going back to Sri Lanka, is the debt to GDP ratio, debt to reserve ratio. There are things that are not being considered in the commentary around this. People take these numbers and say, their GDP was pretty high, so they don't consider the debt aspect at all.
right,
So and PPP as well, right? That's another measure of the economic health that is often touted as something that needs to be considered, and thus India is behind Sri Lanka.
right. So, one particular comparison that people do about debt to reserves, I think external debt to reserve is not a very good parameter. I mean, it is useful in some instances, but when you have a large enough economy, say to the size of India, right,
Mhm.
you can always raise external debt if you want to. So you don't have the problem of repayment through reserves, because if you have to say pay $230 million from your reserves of 530, I'm using million deliberately because we're talking in a hypothetical situation. Uh, so so you can always raise 230 million more debt for the next 15 years and repay that, or maybe even 250, because the size of your economy is larger, you can raise more money.
Mhm.
Uh, in the case of Sri Lanka, what actually transpired was it was primarily an economy that saw a lot of reserves come in via tourism, had a lot of healthy exports, etc. But when tourism stopped during the pandemic, they were in a difficult spot, and they had very less kind of uh, choices or policy options on the table. For some reason, they kind of decided that they want to do organic farming, and they made a lot of policy missteps which compounded the problem. Uh, in India, that again, as I said, I don't see how any comparison can be drawn, because yes, they had a higher per capita GDP, they had a better living standard, and everything at some point in time. But so did Pakistan for the first 40 years of independence. Uh, they were very much ahead of us in every parameter you want to look at. Their roads, certain of their highways till date today are much better than most of our highways.
Mhm.
Uh, but then why it went in the other direction? Well, again, scale, size, ability to consistently find good policies, implement good policies, healthy, robust democracy. Uh, those are important factors for
But India is
sustaining.
not a healthy, robust democracy.
Yeah, I mean, some people think, yeah, well, for them, to be very honest, their definition of healthy democracy, I think, is not very healthy for India, because, uh, I mean, you can't have a monopoly over political power. That's the argument that they want to use. But then, why wasn't this argument applied from 1947 till say late 1980s? The same argument is equally applicable there. Yes, there is a space for opposition and democracy, and I agree, and I really want the democracy to get its
Absolutely.
act together. But will you get your act together if you're talking about, I don't know, teleprompter? It's crazy. I mean, you, why would anyone take you seriously in
Oh, but
that context?
there's statues that are now being discussed. We've moved on from a teleprompter to the symbol, national emblem, the statue of
Yeah, I
Gandhi
mean,
being
exactly.
discussed.
And I was okay. Come on, guys. I mean, do we really care whether it is an aggressive lion or whether it is a, tame lion?
But
How?
I will say that it's less the politicians. See, politicians will have politics if they can't, if they can't discuss heavier topics, perhaps go more in depth and reach their audiences, they will discuss these things. It is also the fault of the media to entertain this nonsense. I do think so,
I
because
agree. I agree.
someone's magnifying these issues, right? Nobody's
Right.
actually going to the citizen and asking them what they care about. However, they take these sound bites and blow them up. And now we have to think about these things.
Exactly. I mean, I would rather have more people, more politicians, more member of parliaments in India discuss about improving female labor force participation rates in the country. I would talk, I mean, I would really appreciate if they talk more about issues relating to working standards. How do we create more, kind of employment for unskilled surplus labor from agriculture? Like, those are the
Mm,
issues that have to be discussed, debated amongst different states. Certain states have been successful in moving their surplus labor from agriculture to manufacturing.
right.
Certain states haven't been able to do that. So why is it that certain states have been able to do that and certain states haven't? Then there are states like Punjab, which were like doing exceptionally well at a point in time, and then they lost their advantage. And they made mistakes,
That
but
was
it's
school
important.
textbooks.
Yeah,
Indian school textbooks had the example of Punjab. While the sex ratio was pointed out as being pretty abysmal, their economic growth was lauded in Indian textbooks for a long time, I remember.
right. So, I mean, these are important issues that for some reason people don't want to discuss. And then they have a problem saying that the democracy is not functioning well. Well, I mean, when you have non serious people engage in policy conversations and
Mm,
get elected, this is bound to happen. So why don't you, uh, if it is indeed the case that the opposition should be strengthened, then ultimately it is the responsibility of the opposition to
right.
strengthen itself. Nobody else is going to do that. So what are you doing to fix it? And from what I can see, there are a lot of lectures happening in this part of the world. Their member of parliaments and their representatives keep coming and talking about state of the Indian democracy here. But the fact is that largely the electorate has rejected them.
Mm.
So how well do they understand what is going on in the country? Or
Oh, that's because we are an electoral autocracy. Because even though the electorate has rejected them, we remain an autocracy that has elected an autocratic government,
so
according
by
to the Freedom House report.
Yeah, I mean, a friend of mine is actually doing some interesting work on that. So let's see when that's out. But I mean, a lot of these indices, I think they're too simplified. I think a lot of them have to be evaluated deeply before using them for drawing any inferences. But what media does is that it picks it up, takes the juicy conclusion, and prints it, and then people form their perception on it. Take the example of Oxfam reports, right? Recently, Noah Smith wrote a blog uh, on his website, or I think Substack, about the problems with Oxfam that they have and how it is consistently, and his terms are serial offender, right? But in India, people don't have any problem taking it at face value. I've had
Interesting that
journalists.
Noah Smith wrote that report. That's not someone I would expect that from, because typically he is, yeah, he's not particularly unsupportive of some of these suggestions that economists have for India as well.
No, but Oxfam is a different ballgame
Yeah,
altogether.
yeah, I understand.
So
Yeah, but he's still an unexpected person.
yeah, yeah. I mean, and similarly, with there are issues with a lot of other data sets available as well, such as the World Inequality Database, right? But
Hmm. Yeah.
people just, I mean, it's easy. See, when you give a press report or a media handout, right, for a journalist 1 2 years into the job, it is very easy and it is very tempting to just follow it, add certain hyperbole, publish the story as it is. We live in a very fast moving world, right? So they want to get it out as soon as they can. And I think that's the problem. That's the issue. That is why we don't get the context that we need or deserve.
So there was a report about democracy in India by an Indian. There was a counter report, but it did not gain much traction at all. Actually, I I know it's not from the Freedom House, but the media itself. I remember there was one I think conversation that I remember on Times Now where it was discussed. However, considering the widespread views, even if you Google, if you were to Google Indian democracy report at this time, it would be the WeDem report showing up, even though it's not indigenous, it's not made with consideration for Indian
Right.
measures at all. There's no Indian parameters that are, or any global south related parameters, or any real, anything with data actually there. So,
Right.
because I've gone through the Freedom Report, I wrote a pretty angry thread about it because it has no information. It has zero data points to go by. It places India 21 or 23 points below Tunisia, which was a coup ongoing. So
Right.
that's a little too not very credible, I think, on the face of it. So I'd love to understand how they measure these parameters, but I also think that there's a ton of parameters that are lacking in the report. We've not considered the accessibility of, say, legal measures to the citizens. We've not considered how independent the judiciary is and how, whether they're elected or not. We've not considered things like EVMs versus, paper ballots. There's there's a ton of measures that I don't think have been considered in the report at
Yeah.
all that play
I'll,
play.
I'll, uh, I'll send you a paper. I think it's in Chicago Law. I'm I don't remember the journal, but I'll send you a paper where it talks about it's a law and economics journal, and they look at judgments in Supreme Court over the last decade or so, predominantly the previous establishment, so to say. And what it finds is that judgments were being exchanged for jobs, post-retirement jobs.
Oh wow! Where is this? Like, sorry, is this India or the US?
It's in India, Supreme Court of India,
Oh my God, that's
and nobody talked about that paper.
I'd love to. I'd love to have a read, and I'd probably be writing about that because this is a pretty important topic, especially considering current churn and the electorate finally understanding how utterly inaccessible the judiciary is for the common person.
Exactly. I mean, like if somebody wants to criticize the Indian democracy, and I'm of course not an expert in political science or institutions per
Sure.
se, but I would say that the biggest criticism I have is for us not realizing that institutional overreach is pretty much a norm of the day,
Mm.
and we have made justice a luxury, And
Absolutely. Oh wow, that's a great point.
and honestly, is that how we want a democracy to function? That's the first step that we need. I mean, criminal justice reform, yet another issue, right? Nobody talks about it. Nobody is interested in fixing this, right? Everyone takes offense when you arrest someone who belongs to their particular school of thought, but nobody wants a systematic addressal of the problem. So what you have is that if there is someone of your kind of school of thought, you would mobilize your resources, get him out of prison. But if the same law, if the same principle, which is unjust, is applied to someone else, you would cheer, you would be happy, you'd party, you'd go to, I don't know,
Go to Hawaii.
Bukhara or yeah, I don't think they can afford
That's
Hawaii.
happening
So
right now in Hawaii.
that's just very few champagne socialists. But I'm talking more about people, at certain establishments who want a lot of donations, and yet they use that donation money to go to Bukhara or any other fancy restaurant. So
Hmm. Right, there was an entire, I think, socialist communist group also that was recently photographed at one such restaurant.
yeah,
Anyway, moving on from politics back to economics. Um, you've we've gone through some quite a few topics, and there's a few things that stand out. You said that GDP per capita, purchasing power, all of these things are not necessarily an accurate measure of the health of an economy, of a nation's economy. How would you see it being restructured? What do you think would be a good measure of the economy? Not maybe one parameter, but what would you, in a report, like to see instead of these random data points that are often taken out of context to suit political agendas? What would you think is a genuine understanding of the economic health?
I would say that in light of this particular pandemic, right, which was a large shock, uh, my view on it is that to view the health of an economy, we need to see the resilience of the economy, which means we need to kind of imagine different kinds of shocks that we can subject the economy in a hypothetical situation, and then see how the economy would respond. So we can have like 15 to 30 different scenarios with different probabilities, some of them mutually independent, some of them not mutually independent, and then see how the fundamentals of the economy uh, are able to handle that kind of shock. Uh, I haven't seen that kind of work happening much. It's more like how you evaluate bond pricing and so on and so forth, right? This is a quintessential market-based approach, right? But I
Yeah.
think that will have a lot more meaningful uh, inferential value for us than looking at just GDP per capita. Take for instance uh, uh, the pandemic, right? And China has a higher GDP per capita, but their economy is still unable to deal with it, whereas India has managed to done rather well in terms of both vaccine delivery and also in terms of getting the economy back on ground. Similarly, Sri Lanka in the
Ask you
event,
if you have any insight on this, since you mentioned China before we move on to Sri Lanka. Can you point out a few areas where China has, failed in this? I mean, not that they failed in the vaccine delivery and the real estate issue that is ongoing, that economics. Why has this happened? Do you have any insight into it?
I think primarily it's because they're following a zero COVID policy. So what I mean, wherever there are cases, they just lock it down and they
Mm,
subject their economy to a fresh shock
mm,
every 2 3 months, and because of that, those shocks. Uh, if you go back to the start of the pandemic, we talked a lot about temporary shocks and inflation being temporary, etc. Right now, when you do these temporary shocks regularly at regular intervals over a long enough period of time, what was earlier perceived to be a temporary phenomena would appear to be permanent in nature. And I think that's more applicable in the case of China. I think they just lifted lockdown in Shanghai recently, and around the same time, they also had that issue of uh, Evergrande and so on and so forth. Then there's a demographic story which is also playing out there. So if I have to compare India and China, I think Indian economy has a lot more buffer, at least as of today, to be subject to certain kinds of shocks than China. But this buffer exists largely because of favorable demographics and you know in general the population being very enterprising, open to consumption and so on and so forth,
mm,
not as an outcome of deliberate policy. uh, and the reason I say not as an outcome of deliberate policy is because pandemic has taken a toll on finances, right? It's going to take at least 2 years before we can revert in terms of our uh, debt levels, in terms of our fiscal deficit levels, to something which would broadly resemble what it would have been in the absence of pandemic, maybe 3, maybe 4 years.
Mm,
After that, it would be a function of policy. But at least as of today, there was a very large exogenous shock to which the policy responded. It
mm,
responded very well. But if there's another shock, this time around the buffer zone is being created by favorable demographics and entrepreneurial people in general. And that's one of the reasons why, even in the event of rate hikes and global volatility, you see a lot of dynamism in the Indian economy. You startups are of course cutting back.
mm.
There are job losses, and then that cycle is ending. But you don't see that translate into a kind of pessimistic overturn as it did in 2010 to 13.
Right. Right. No, that's true. And I think the issue about monetary policy not being very friendly in that sense has been brought up several times, and the Jail for Doing Business report was also quite popular. It pointed out quite a few issues that even the entrepreneurs face, right?
Right.
So those are definitely things to be wary about. Now, one thing that I'd like to discuss is the Federal Reserve buffer. The uh, how does it actually help a nation? Like you've mentioned resilience quite a few times, so that's one thing that I wanted to discuss.
Well, that's again, so that's the other source of buffer that we have. Buffer in the sense that what India is seeing is that a lot of FIIs are pulling out money, right? So, in terms of accounting, there are two kinds of accounts that we maintain. One is, of course, uh, for trade of goods and services, and the other is for capital flows. That's the broad way to conceptualize it. Now, in terms of trade, India imports more than it exports.
Mm,
So, which means that we need to pay more dollars than the dollars that we earn,
mm,
right? So, which is why we have a deficit. Now, this is largely financed by capital inflows because dollars come in and we have a surplus, and most of the dollars don't really have to go out. So, the net of capital and the trade account is what determines whether you have something being added to your trade, to your reserves, or subtracted to your reserves. In the present scenario, what we are seeing quite forcefully is that there's a lot of capital volatility, and at the same time, our trade deficit has also gone up because of oil prices. Now, under such a circumstance, because we have reserves, people know that we have the ability to finance it up to a certain point. And because we have the ability to finance it up to a certain point, uh, we don't fear a repeat of the 2013 taper tantrum. So the reserves kind of help in two ways. It gives you a credible threat of intervention in the event of speculators going for a run on your currency.
You want to
That's
give the example of the UK?
Yeah, I mean that's a good one. So, but I would actually give an example
For
of
the audience,
2013.
because it's kind of out of current memory, if you could explain it. Because
I would rather use an Indian example of 2013 because that that might be more recent in the memory of people. But exactly what transpired in 2013 was that we had a high current account deficit. We had huge capital outflows happening because of the rate hike cycle there, and as an outcome, our reserves were going down, and speculators were betting that the rupee is going to weaken further. And because they were doing that, the rupee actually was sliding, and Reserve Bank had to spend more and more amount of the dollar reserves to be able to arrest the fall in the rupee. And eventually, when D. Subbrao, who was the governor at that time, he resigned, and Raghuram Rajan came in. After a week or two, that slide stopped, and a lot of the policy interventions during D. Subbrao, which were also in consultation with Rajan maybe, were useful to prevent that slide from becoming a free flow sliding situation. Now, the reason why speculators may not try to do something similar against the rupee today is because A, rupee is actually gaining against the uh, pound, yen, and euro. And so you can't really make a accurate assessment of what's going on, and how likely this kind of reversal is going to persist. Of course, the expectation is that Fed is going to hike rates going forward and so on and so forth, but it's difficult to time it properly. And the second thing is that if you're a trader and if you know that the RBI is sitting on 500 plus billion dollar of reserves, they can easily part way with 50,
market.
60 billion dollars. And so you wouldn't want to place a bet
Mm,
knowing very well that there's a lot of excess capital available at the counterparty, which can kind of uh, intervene to get a particular price in the market. Also, this is important because let's give an example of Pakistan. The problem in Pakistan is that it again imports a lot more than it exports, so it needs greater dollars, but it doesn't earn those dollars, and the capital flows into the economy have also slowed down. So they need their reserves not from the point of view of defending their currency, but they need their reserves more from the point of view of financing their uh, imports and also their debt repayment. So for
Okay.
every country, the role of reserves is very different. In a healthy economy, reserves are just a buffer stock, which is
Mm.
where India is. But the question is, what should be the adequate amount of buffer that you need to maintain? And I think 500 plus billion dollars is good enough. So we can go up to 500 without any consequences at this stage.
I've heard that our current finance ministry is extremely conservative, so they might just keep on increasing the buffers. Why I mentioned the UK specifically, why I mentioned England, was because this shorting went to an extreme state.
Right.
In fact, one of the documentaries, I think it was by a big publication, either Bloomberg or one of those documentaries, actually tried to whitewash this and called White Wednesday, because it helped drive those monetary changes for England. That's why I was bringing that up.
Yeah, I mean, but
For which
there was
they can be destabilized.
right. There was a certain individual who made a lot of money. So
Yeah, so that's why I kind of asked about this for the audiences. George Soros shorted the pound, and the Bank of England had to sort of it was begging, and it drove a lot of. He made 10 billion, I think, right?
right, a lot of money. Yeah, quite a lot. I
A
think
lot of money from the
yeah,
citizens of England,
right.
because the Bank of England did not have enough buffers to stem that shorting.
But see again, that was an exceptional circumstance which I
Yeah.
don't foresee in India. I mean, so
No, of
that's why I
course
didn't.
not.
Yeah,
Of
yeah,
course not. However, it kind of highlights the need of reserves,
right.
right? Why
Yeah,
reserves are important, and why, despite whatever people say about the economy failing, our reserves are at one of the highest it's ever been, probably the
right.
highest it's ever been.
Yeah, I mean,
So
now I see people talk about reserves being lower, reducing, right? Reducing 600 billion, but we got there only because of the pandemic, and it was bound to be reduced at some point. So
yeah,
so people kind of missed that nuance again. That it went to 600, has to come back to
yes, yes,
500.
right.
So
Well, still, we're very well placed, I think, and especially considering the current geopolitical scenario and sort of undulating movements across all charts. Could you give us an overview of how you see this play out? How long this volatility will last across the spectrum? What India has to gain and what it has to lose? Like you said, FIIs were, pulling out, and how are we preparing ourselves for the foreseeable future?
yeah, I it's difficult to answer when the volatility will end. Usually 6 to 8 months is a good enough estimate. But with inflation in certain parts of the world, particularly in West, uh, being at the levels that it is, even non-food fuel is at 6% in the US, 5.9 to be precise. Yeah. Uh, I as I said, it's difficult to time it out. The fact is that there are way too many unknowns. You don't know which way central banks are going to go in the near term. Will they become more aggressive in terms of rate hikes, or will they continue with the guidance that they provided us till now? But it's also certain that once we do go down this path, interest rates will have to be brought down again to support the economy. So, so in effect, what India is looking for is a situation where there's a sharp reversal of capital flows, hot money, so to say. And again, it is going to come back in maybe
Mm,
in a year, maybe in 2 years. So there's that kind of volatility. Now, what should we do? Capital controls are one thing that can be explored, but why do it?
mm, mm,
Because our economy, as I said, is in a position where it doesn't need to intervene
mm,
to be able to deal with this volatility excessively. What we need is to ensure that any kind of movement in the exchange rate happens in an orderly manner. Right. So if the
right.
rupee has to go to 85, it has to go slowly. If it has to go to 75, it has to go slowly. We don't want any volatile extreme movements. And as long as we ensure that, I think we should be good to go. The bigger concern is slowing growth may impact us through our trade channel. And if global growth is slow, our exports growth is going to be slow. which basically means that we need to kind of think innovatively about our exchange rate framework.
Which we are doing, I think.
I think so. I think so because there's a lot of talk around this time around interventions by RBI, which is happening. So I'm kind of optimistic that some of that stuff might actually happen. See, the thing is, when global growth slows down, chances are that certain of these hyper competitive countries tweak their exchange rates to become competitive in order to get more growth.
Right.
Now, to be able to respond to that, we also need to intervene. Now, it's a very bad strategy because everyone gets into a competitive
Absolutely.
devaluation.
Right.
But at least you need to give a credible threat that don't do this, otherwise we will also do this, and nobody gains in the process.
Hmm.
So
Okay. So in this scenario with, we are seeing the dollar lose a lot of its status as a global economy because, like you said, we need to have that buffer, that threat um, placement. So, using different currencies, trading in different currencies other than the dollar. We had the barter system with Indonesia. So there's quite a few measures in the trade scenario that
right,
are being implemented, right? So that plays into our stability. Um,
I think so. Basically, I I believe that never bet against the US dollar because it has become de facto
right.
a safe haven, right? It's despite all things said and done, people today are still willing to hold dollars despite inflation at 9% rather than hold any other currency. Uh, but having said that, the fact that there is an effort to de-risk from movements in exchange rates,
Mm,
uh, and the fact that people are moving away their reserves from dollar to gold or to other basket of currencies, I think all of that is a very healthy signal. It is also good for the US
mm,
because what happens right now is any change by the US central bank has implications world over. By reducing the amount of dependence, they can also design policy without taking into, I don't think they take into account, but they can reduce the interlinkages from second, third order effects. So to some extent, it makes it easier for them to respond to recessions when they know that if we print $100 billion, only $80 billion will remain in the economy and 20 would go into other central banks' reserves. As against, say, if they print 100, only 40 comes to US, 60 goes everywhere else. So I think for the global economy, it would be much better. Would make central banks more effective in terms of dealing with situations such as recessions. Will also give them the necessary tools to think about dealing clean financing, green financing, so to say, or the energy transition. Uh, I would, however, say that we must also at the same time be a bit careful about certain movements that are happening by certain countries, one of which happens to be an old friend of ours, on the currency framework front that they're trying to build. Uh, because India's external threat environment has changed drastically. So our economic policies will also have to adjust to the changing geopolitical threat that we face. Uh, if anything, there is a there is a mutual incentive that India has with certain parts in Western world to push for trade deals, and I think that's very important. It doesn't matter in which currency those deals are kind of finalized. I mean, in the sense that it doesn't matter whether we trade with UK in euro or in GBP, Indian rupee, or in dollars. As long as we have a trade deal, it's necessary. Vendors can invoice in whatever currency they want to. But those trade deals are important, and those are far more important at this moment than any of the other movements that we might make on the currency framework.
interesting.
Unfortunately, yeah, I mean, unfortunately, with Boris out, nobody knows what's going to happen with respect to the Indo-UK trade deal. But I think if we can immediately tie up within the next 2 to 3 years a trade deal with US, Canada, UK, and Europe, which will be in addition to the one we have with UAE and Australia,
Mm, right,
I
right.
think we're in pretty good shape.
I think this will make for a different conversation altogether about valuable about the value essentially of trade deals, how they've played out for India so far. Because from what I understand, it's not had a major impact. Certainly not the kind of impact that is expected from an FTA. And I mean, it's good for building ties and enhancing a slow movement towards geopolitical dependencies. However, it hasn't panned out that well for India. Perhaps it
There,
has to do with our manufacturing, but
yeah, I mean,
I'm
there are
not.
two aspects. There are two aspects. One is the big picture aspect. We do all kinds of reforms and all kinds of order, and then wonder why we don't get the results. Take the example of domestic trade liberalization and domestic production liberalization that happened in 1990s. We allowed people to set up industry, but we kept agriculture under check.
Mm,
Usually, you allow agriculture first, and then you allow manufacturing. So what happened was there was no agricultural surplus which could move from agriculture to manufacturing.
manufacturing.
So that kind of didn't work out the way we wanted. Then we did trade deals without liberalizing our land policy, our labor policy, without reducing our cost of capital, without being competitive on the corporate taxation rates, without creating a policy framework for boosting manufacturing in the country. We had something known as the SEZs, but those SEZs were not exactly SEZs as they are in China, etc. We didn't adopt the plug and play model that they adopt, right? So all said and done, when we have things being done in a haphazard, disorderly manner, we won't get the result. That's the big picture. So we did trade deals prematurely, and we did trade deals with countries where the productivity adjusted wage was lower than in India. So we were anyway
Huh?
not competitive. Yeah, like productivity adjusted wages with certain Asian countries in
Right,
India.
right. Yes, of course.
So when you go and sign deals thinking that okay, this is a small economy, let's do it with this,
That's
it
why
doesn't work
ASEAN
that
has not worked out for us at
right,
all.
right.
Yeah.
And the second part,
Apart
which
from
is
the things, country of origin being China
yeah,
and then assembly
yeah,
and other. Yeah.
and the second point, which I think is equally important, uh, is that our we don't have a system to make our producers aware of these trade deals and their benefits. So that ignorance uh, is also a factor that prevents them from maximizing the benefits of these deals.
Mm.
As you mentioned, like I mean, we're too busy discussing statues and stuff like that rather than discussing fine print of. I mean, let's go and talk to 50 manufacturers who export to Australia and see how many of them actually know about the contents of that deal.
Mm.
And you would be surprised that despite the best efforts by the government, very few of them would actually be aware of most of the benefits. And the reason is that media doesn't do that great job of informing people in India, despite being too independent.
Right, right. Well, that's something to think about. And, media is often a matter of discussion on this channel. So, economic and policy discussions are definitely something that need to be more center stage in media discussions, in media led discussions at this time. But, Karan, a very broad understanding, and I'll let you go enjoy the rest of your Sunday soon. One very broad point that I wanted you to throw some light on is how how does economics tie into geopolitical scenarios as a whole? How important because most people today, however literate they are, have a lot of misconceptions. We've all, I mean, not you, of course, but as a generalist and not an economist, we've all held some misconceptions. I'm sure a lot of the viewers have several ideas that, they might want to re examine at some point. How do you think it ties into geopolitics about national security? We discussed how the pound was shorted, things like that. How important is an economic understanding, and what are things that people could read or people could watch to, apart from this video, what could they watch to better understand the economic scenario?
Well, I mean, I think it's quite important because whether it's national security or geopolitics or whatever, right? You need money. You need money to be able to uh, pay for national security, pay for roads, pay for everything. So you need money in that sense. But uh, for people to be able to understand how these linkages, I mean, there are a couple of papers that I can suggest, but I don't think people would be interested in uh, going through papers or books per se. But the sad reality is that unfortunately, if you want to understand this, you have to, at the end of the day,
Papers are a little too technical, I think, but if they were to look up,
no,
even definitely.
I mean policy papers. Like yeah, I mean, I guess even those are slightly technical. People can go on Investopedia to understand certain finance concepts. That's a good resource. I remember in school, I used to go up there quite a lot to understand certain concepts. That's there, and then there are a lot of good YouTube
What kind
videos.
of a student were you going to Investopedia in school? Most people bunk classes and
Yeah, we used to
stay.
do that too. We used to do that too, but I mean, we did both, I guess. So,
Okay, good to hear that.
and yeah, the thing is that I anyway had sciences with economics, right? So it was like too much happening in different subjects. So you kind of wanted to get a better sense of what's going on in economics per se, as against people who are doing commerce with maths. But anyway, that aside, so I think Investopedia is a good resource, and then there are a lot of YouTube videos. You just go and search on geopolitics, India. I saw one video by Bloomberg recently which talked about India being the next superpower, uh, which was very surprising because we know who writes for Bloomberg on India, and then you have this video. So I think the person who made the video didn't read certain columns in Bloomberg. Maybe I don't know.
Interesting. Well, at least they have a diversity of viewpoints. If there were a way for you to send across that video, I will link it down below because
I'll do that.
uh,
Yeah.
because
My, one of my co-author, Arvind Virmani,
yes,
he tends to focus a lot on the intersection of economics, geopolitics, and national security.
his
In fact,
tweets are too technical and uh,
yeah,
a
but
lot of acronyms there. So
yes, but he has a website. If you go to his website, you'll find a lot of blog posts and a lot of papers that are there, which are not that technical. They might be slightly long, but they are very good resources to understand what's going on. And he runs this think tank called EGRO Foundation. They also have a lot of good material on their website uh, on this. So I think those are some India-specific material that might be of interest. Then there's Brookings, which has a lot of good material with a global perspective. Then there's Rand Corporation, which again has a more global outlook.
I'd like to point to very specific resources from these organizations. Because again, the diversity of viewpoints means that we have to do a lot of picking and choosing to offer a certain perspective, and
Right, but I mean that only the technical aspects of it, like
right.
not the views, but the concepts of it.
No, so why I had this question was because we were discussing a combination of GDP, PPP, debt, reserves, foreign reserves. I think is that federal reserves, but yeah, foreign reserves, and all of these things, how they essentially tie in together, and where each of these data points, when they're blown up by the media or to create headlines, how an ordinary person can view these in context of a larger picture. If there were a way to explain these things, if there were a single resource to explain these things a little better, because I think perhaps being immersed in these subjects, we may have a little we may have a certain understanding, but then when somebody of high repute like Raghuram Rajan or someone like Subramaniam Swamy, if they go on to media houses and they discuss how the government is essentially keeping the people poor by not printing money because it's essentially paper, which is something I've heard one of them say, is they will not actually, it will prompt people to think that why aren't we doing this, because this is a question
Yeah,
of refuge, and it's called deference to authority, right? So it's a natural instinctual thing. So how does somebody understand that maybe there's an agenda, maybe they're merely
yeah, it's unfortunately
misinformed,
yeah, it's
right?
difficult to find a resource which will help. Uh, it's we don't have the straight answer is we don't have any resource at the moment.
Okay, right,
But
something.
why
Write a
don't you
book.
set? Yeah,
ABC of economics and intersections with geopolitics.
I mean, there is a book, Day-to-Day Economics by IIM professor, which is of use, but it gives you a very superficial understanding, which might not, like the argument you made about it just being paper, right? This is a modern monetary theory argument. Uh, Unfortunately, it has gained traction in many parts of the world, but its criticism is
Which
too
have
technical.
all suffered, right? Which have all suffered. We've seen how any country who's implemented that is not even spoken of as an economy. They're just spoken of as outlier nations like Zimbabwe or Venezuela.
Right. So,
So
so
civil
I
wars.
mean, so that's the thing, right? I mean that this idea has gained a lot of momentum because of inflation being historically low. So people thought that okay, let's try it out. What's the worst thing that can happen? Uh, and then the worst thing that could happen has happened in terms of inflation coming back. Uh,
And for the viewers, I'd just like to clarify that this is not a mild scenario. This is not something that can be tried. The reason that the current finance ministry is focused on a supply side economy is to have and it's a conservative standpoint, is because demand-led economies tend to have a lot of hyperinflation. So even if you're seeing 7% over, slightly over 7% inflation right now, it's not unmanageable. But if we were to inflate it further, it would become unmanageable, which is what
Unimaginable.
happens when lots of stimuli is
Yeah, I mean, we
provided.
would have been at 12, 13% inflation.
Right. So you've written about welfarism and poverty and how it's a necessary aspect of a country like ours, certainly. So, and we've mentioned that in context of certain states as well. So, how do you see? Uh, you're in favor of direct cash transfers over the current procurement process with regards to food welfare systems. So, how do you see that playing out later, and how necessary do you think is the ongoing continuance of these stimuli?
I think some amount of reversal of the stimulus is going to happen in September. That's at least what I could gather from media reports. That people in the finance ministry apparently told some journalist, I think it was an interview or something, that September is when they are planning to get rid of the program. And I think that's an appropriate decision. I think they should have gotten rid of it maybe 3 months back. But their point is also valid that when you give people this kind of support, you don't want to prematurely pull away support for those who genuinely need it. And there still is some amount of stress in certain sectors related to tourism, etc. So I think that's gonna be reversed soon, and that will of course play out in terms of easing of build up price pressures in the economy as well to some extent. Uh, but I think it was a very prudent policy response from the start. It's not that India didn't do demand side interventions.
No, we
It,
did.
it, we did, but we being well aware of the fiscal space that we had, and we learned from the lessons we kind of should have learned from the 2008 crisis. So we didn't want to overstimulate the economy.
Mm, mm.
Problem in US was that they didn't want to understimulate because they understimulated in 2008. And while working, for policymakers, there's a lot of uncertainty
Right.
because you don't know what multipliers are there and so on and so forth. It's difficult.
Mm,
So my guess is when policymakers decided that okay, let's instead of doing 50, let's do 100, because in the previous case the parameter, the multiplier was 0.25, so it's going to be 0.25, so we need to do maybe 100. They did 100, but in this case the parameter became
mm.
0.50 or 0.75. So essentially, when you did 100, 75% of it came into the system, whereas you were expecting only
20.
25% of it to come into the system. So I would say that even in the West, it is an error, but it is not an error that would have been known prior to
Mm.
committing that error. We have the benefit of hindsight now.
Well, of
Uh,
course, for them, I think, especially with the US, with the US being the global standard, with the dollar being the standard currency for much of the global trade, it's understandable that they might not have foreseen it.
right. But for India, it would have been a wrong strategy to go with it from the start, primarily because of the 2008 experience and also because of where the debt levels were already in 2020. You see, in 2013, we basically tried to hide away our actual debt,
Mm.
and that practice continued till 2019
Yes.
because nobody wanted to. These are institutional things. Once you accept that your predecessor did something of that sort, nobody will take any of your numbers seriously.
Mm, mm.
So to maintain that institutional credibility, they were trying to deal with it in a very gradual manner. When the pandemic happened, uh, people looked at the headline inflation at 4, 3, and they're like, okay, you can spend, but I think the ministry itself was aware that okay, it's not 3, it's actually 6 or 7 or something. So they were very smart in terms of taking that into the calculation while determining the deficit. Whereas a lot of the experts, and I would say that at times even I don't have complete information. It's only those who are there,
Mm.
kind of involved in the day-to-day things who know these things very well. They know the ins and out of all the fiscal accounting. So many people who were not aware of these fiscal kind of challenges, they looked at 3. They said, okay, you can go to 6, so do 3% of GDP. They didn't
Mm.
know that we were already at 6. So if we do
Mm.
3% more, it's 9%, and then states do another 2%, so it's 11%.
Right.
And that would have been a suicide.
Right. No, that's true. All right, I think that's quite a lot of. I intended to keep this slightly shorter, but it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and these
Same
are
here.
important topics that I think viewers need to look into a little in depth and do a little bit of their own research, because it's not as hard as the pink papers typically sound like. It's
Right.
macroeconomics is simply not that technical, and it's quite interesting, especially when one considers the number of people who've come into the market as speculative traders of
Right.
late. So it's quite an interesting topic as well. So I hope there's been a lot of information that thanks, Karan, for providing so
Right.
much information on.
If I may add on a parting note, if people genuinely do want to understand some of these things, uh, intermediate macro book macroeconomics by Olivier Blanchard is a good starting point. And then there's another one by Stan Fisher.
Hmm.
Now these are primarily econ honors textbooks, I think first or second year, depending upon which university you are. But it's written nicely, explains a lot of concepts, has a lot of case studies. So for those who are genuinely interested, the only way to be able to separate the BS from the good. This is the only way. I mean, you need to put in the effort to go through the book, and after that, you're kind of well aware of the pitfalls for any argument the moment you see it.
Right. I will link those below. Thank you. And I would suggest watching Karan, watching Dr. Virmani, Dr. Bhalla on, they've been on several news channels to talk about the paper, but generally they are very well known in their own field and are often called on panels as experts. So do look up their videos. I'm sure there's several of them available online on YouTube as well. So, and maybe watch this video and the previous one with Karan a few times. So, because there's a lot of information going on, so it's quite necessary to go through some of these and build your own arguments, your own points of view, perspectives. Anyway, thanks so much for joining me today, Karan, and it's been a pleasure. Have a wonderful rest of the weekend, and see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.